On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century by Timothy Snyder. Picture this. It's a frigid night in Berlin, February 1933. The air practically crackles with tension. A new leader has just seized power, a man brimming with fiery promises and simmering with dark resentments. Suddenly, against the night sky, an orange glow appears. Then flames. The Reichstag, the beating heart of German democracy, their parliament building, is burning. As firefighters race to the scene and chaos erupts in the streets, the new leader, Adolf Hitler, seizes his moment. He declares it a terrorist attack, proclaiming that the nation faces grave danger from its enemies. His words are chilling. There will be no mercy now. Anyone standing in our way will be cut down. Here's the terrifying part. In that single moment, with the embers of that one building still glowing, modern freedom in Germany began to die. Within 24 hours, a decree suspended the basic rights of all citizens: freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to a fair trial. Gone, just like that. A state of emergency was declared. That emergency would stretch for 12 long years, until the end of a world war that claimed millions of lives. One moment of shock, one act of terror, real or manufactured, it barely mattered, was all it took to transform a fragile democracy into a monstrous regime. This isn't just some dusty tale from a forgotten history book. It's a warning. And it's exactly the kind of warning that historian Timothy Snyder has dedicated his life to studying. Snyder, a professor at Yale University, is one of the world's leading experts on the darkest chapters of the 20th century, the rise of fascism, Nazism, and communism across Europe. A few years ago, he felt an urgent need to share what he'd learned. He noticed patterns from the past echoing ominously in the present, so he wrote a short, powerful book called On Tyranny. It wasn't some dense academic textbook. It was a field manual for citizens, a slim, urgent guide with 20 simple yet profound lessons on spotting the warning signs of tyranny and, more importantly, resisting it. The book became an instant, unexpected bestseller, translated into dozens of languages and held aloft by protesters around the world. Why? Because it answers the question that whispers in the back of our minds. How does it happen? How do free societies crumble? And crucially, what can I do about it? Today, we're going to walk through that field manual together. But this isn't just about history. My promise to you is that by the end of our time together, you'll have a clear set of tools. You'll understand the subtle psychological traps that tyrants lay for us, and you'll have a practical playbook for being a thoughtful, courageous, and effective citizen. This is about learning from the past to protect our future. The most chilling lesson Timothy Snyder gives us is also his very first one, and it's the key that unlocks everything else. Do not obey in advance. It sounds simple, but it's a deeply unsettling idea. We tend to think tyranny is imposed from the top down. Soldiers in the streets, secret police knocking on doors. And yes, that happens. But Snyder argues that much of an authoritarian's power isn't taken, it's freely given. He tells the story of Austria in 1938. Hitler was in power in Germany and threatening to annex his neighbor Austria. But here's the strange part. Before German tanks had even crossed the border, something disturbing started happening. Local Austrian Nazis, and more disturbingly, ordinary Austrians who weren't Nazis, began acting on their own. They started capturing their Jewish neighbors and forcing them to scrub the streets. They looted Jewish-owned shops. They did it without being asked. This is what Snyder calls anticipatory obedience. It's when citizens, sensing a shift in power, start thinking ahead. They ask themselves, what will a more repressive government want from me? And then they offer it up proactively, hoping to get on the right side of the new regime. A citizen who adapts this way, Snyder warns, is teaching power what it can do. They're showing the new rulers just how far and how fast they can go. The Nazis and Communists, in their early days, were stunned and delighted by how many people voluntarily offered their services, their loyalty, and their silence. You might think, well, that was them, that was then, I would never do that. But would we? In the 1960s, a psychologist at Yale named Stanley Milgram was haunted by Nazi atrocities. He wanted to understand how so many seemingly ordinary German citizens could participate in such horror. So he designed an experiment. He brought in regular people, students and residents from New Haven, Connecticut, and told them they were part of a study on learning. Their job was to sit at a control panel with switches, each marked with increasing voltage. On the other side of a glass window, another participant was hooked up to electrodes. Every time that person got a question wrong, the subject was instructed to deliver an electric shock, increasing the voltage each time. But here's the secret. The person behind the glass was an actor. The shocks weren't real. But the subjects didn't know that. As they flipped the switches, the actor would pretend to be in agony. They'd scream, pound on the glass, complain of a heart condition. As the voltage climbed higher, they'd fall silent, as if dead. The subject administering the shocks could see all of this. They were clearly distressed. Yet when the man in the white lab coat, standing behind them, simply said, "Please continue," most of them did. A shocking number went all the way to the final switch, the one marked with lethal voltage. Milgram's conclusion was terrifying. It wasn't some special authoritarian personality that made people cruel. It was that ordinary people, placed in a new setting with new rules, are remarkably willing to follow instructions from a new authority, even if it means harming others. Tyranny doesn't begin with a monster giving orders. It begins with our own internal instinct to conform, to fit in, to not make waves. It begins when we give power away without being asked. This is why Snyder's 8th lesson is a direct antidote. Stand out. It can feel strange, he admits, to say or do something different from the crowd, but without that feeling of unease, there is no freedom. He reminds us of Rosa Parks. The moment she refused to give up her seat, she broke the spell of the status quo. In that small act of defiance, she showed others what was possible. The moment you set an example, others will follow. And this isn't just about grand, historic gestures. Snyder tells the story of Winston Churchill in 1940. Great Britain stood alone. Hitler had conquered most of Europe and was allied with the Soviet Union. The United States hadn't yet entered the war. Every reasonable advisor, every political calculation, suggested Churchill should make a deal with Hitler to save his country. That was the path of least resistance. But Churchill stood out. He said, "We shall fight on forever and ever and ever." His courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about choosing a different path when everyone else was conforming to the logic of inevitability. His defiance forced Hitler to change his plans, leading to a two-front war Germany couldn't win. One person standing out changed the course of world history. On an even more personal level, Snyder shares the story of Teresa Prokhorova, a very young woman in Poland during the German occupation. Warsaw had been bombed, her father arrested, her brothers prisoners of war. It was a time when the most natural instinct was to shrink into yourself, to think only of survival. But Teresa did the opposite. As the Germans forced Warsaw's Jewish population into a sealed-off ghetto, she watched as her non-Jewish friends and neighbors quietly allowed their Jewish friends to slip out of their lives. They looked away, They cross the street. They conform to the new unspoken rules. Teresa stood out. At great risk to her own life, she began smuggling food and medicine into the ghetto for people she knew and for people she didn't. She eventually helped an entire family escape, saving them from certain death. Years later, when asked about her actions, she simply called them, quote, normal. But from our perspective, they were anything but. They were exceptional. She was willing to be courageous when everyone else was choosing to be comfortable. So if tyranny begins with our quiet internal decision to obey in advance, how do rulers get us to that point? What tools do they use to prime us for submission? Snyder argues that the first and most important front in this battle is the war on reality itself. This is his 10th lesson: believe in truth. To submit to tyranny, he says, is to renounce the difference between what you want to hear and what is actually the case. This can feel pleasant at first. It's comforting to live in a world of simple narratives where your side is always good and the other side always evil. But the result, Snyder warns, is the demise of your own individuality, because it's your ability to discern facts that makes you an individual. He outlines 4 ways that truth dies, based on the work of Victor Klemperer, a Jewish literary scholar who survived the Nazi regime by keeping a secret diary where he meticulously documented the language of the Third Reich. The first way truth dies is through open hostility to verifiable reality. This is when leaders present inventions and lies as if they were facts. When a leader constantly lies, the goal isn't just to deceive you about one particular thing. The goal is to exhaust you. When you're bombarded with so many falsehoods, you eventually give up trying to figure out what's true and what isn't. You begin to think that nothing is true. And if nothing is true, then no one can criticize power, because there's no basis upon which to do so. All that's left is spectacle. The second mode is what Snyder calls shamanistic incantation, the endless repetition of slogans and catchphrases. Think of rallies chanting, "Build that wall," or "Lock him up." The point of the chant isn't to describe something that will actually happen. The point is to create a tribal identity, a shared feeling that bypasses reason. As Klemperer noted, the fascist style depends on endless repetition to make the fictional seem plausible and the criminal seem desirable. The third mode is magical thinking, or the open embrace of contradiction. A leader claims that I alone can fix it. A billionaire president claims to be a man of the people. Fighting corruption means selling the presidency for favors. When you accept these blatant contradictions, you're abandoning reason. Klemperer described how his German friends in 1933 would tell him to just abandon yourself to your feelings and focus on the Führer's greatness rather than the logical absurdities of his policies. The final mode is misplaced faith. This is when a leader presents himself not as a politician, but as a voice of the people, a messianic figure. Once faith in the leader replaces the search for facts, evidence becomes irrelevant. Years later, at the very end of the war, with Germany in ruins, an amputated German soldier told Klemperer, "Hitler has never lied yet. I believe in Hitler." That is the endpoint of the death of truth. This is why Snyder so urgently warns us, post-truth is pre-fascism. The antidote to this is simple, but not easy. First, be kind to our language. This is Lesson 9. When you find yourself repeating the same phrases and slogans you hear on television or online, stop. Think up your own way of speaking. Snyder's advice is radical in its simplicity. Separate yourself from the internet. Read books. Books slow you down. They give you the complex language and nuanced concepts you need to think for yourself, to resist the drumbeat of propaganda. And that leads directly to Lesson 11. Investigate. Don't just be a passive consumer of information. Figure things out for yourself. Spend time with long articles. Pay for a subscription to a real newspaper. Realize that much of what's on the internet is designed to harm you, to trap you in a bubble of outrage and misinformation. An individual who investigates, Snyder says, is also a citizen who builds. A leader who dislikes investigators is a potential tyrant. Once a leader has weakened our collective grip on reality, the next target is the structures designed to protect us, the guardrails of democracy. This is Snyder's second lesson: defend institutions. We tend to think of our institutions, the courts, the press, the rule of law, the voting system, as permanent fixtures, like mountains. We assume they'll always be there. Snyder warns this is a grave mistake. He tells the story of a leading newspaper for German Jews in early 1933, just after Hitler had formed a government. The paper published an editorial expressing calm, reasonable trust. They wrote that Hitler and his friends would not, of course, actually implement their crazy proposals. They wouldn't deprive German Jews of their rights or enclose them in ghettos. Why? Because, the paper argued, there were crucial factors and powers that would hold them in check. That trust was tragically misplaced. The mistake, Snyder writes, is to assume that rulers who come to power through institutions cannot then change or destroy those very institutions, even when that's exactly what they've announced they will do. Institutions don't protect themselves. They're just buildings with rules on paper. They only have power when we, the citizens, actively make them ours by acting on their behalf. So, he says, choose an institution you care about: a court, a newspaper, a law, a labor union, and take its side. This connects directly to his warning in Lesson 3. Beware the one-party state. Both the Nazis in Germany and the Communists in Czechoslovakia came to power through elections. They exploited a moment of victory to begin what he calls salami tactics, slicing off layers of opposition one by one until nothing was left. He shares a heartbreaking and powerful analogy. You don't know when you're making love for the last time, and voting is like that. Some of the Germans who voted for the Nazi Party in 1932, or the Czechs who voted for the Communist Party in 1946, surely knew this might be the last meaningfully free election for a while. But most didn't. They assumed they'd have another chance. They didn't. Any election can be the last one. That's why, he urges, we must support the multi-party system and defend the rules of democratic elections. Vote in local and state elections while you can. Consider running for office. And within those institutions, the role of professionals is critical. This is Lesson 5. Remember professional ethics. Snyder's point is stark. It's hard to subvert a rule of law state without lawyers. It's hard to hold show trials without judges. It's hard to run concentration camps without businessmen interested in cheap labor and civil servants willing to handle the paperwork. He tells the story of Hans Frank, who was Hitler's personal lawyer. After Germany invaded Poland, Frank became the governor of the occupied territory. He was a man of the law, a professional, but he argued that the law was meant to serve the race, and so whatever seemed good for the race was the law. With this simple twist of his professional ethics, he justified the murder of millions. The lesson is that professionals, lawyers, doctors, accountants, engineers, public servants, can either be a society's last line of defense or its most efficient tool of destruction. When you're told that the situation is exceptional, That's precisely when your professional ethics must guide you. There is no such thing as just following orders. So when truth has been eroded and institutions hollowed out, what's left to enforce a tyrant's will? The answer is force. This brings us to Snyder's warnings about violence. In Lesson 6 he says, "Be wary of paramilitaries." He explains that when a political leader surrounds himself with private security guards who begin acting like a personal army, it's a sign of immense danger. The Nazi stormtroopers, the SA and the SS, began as a security detail, clearing Hitler's opponents from his rallies. They created a climate of fear that helped the Nazi Party win elections. When the men with guns who've always claimed to be against the system start wearing uniforms and marching with torches and pictures of a leader, Snyder warns, the end is nigh. And when those paramilitaries begin mingling with the official police and military, the end has come. This is why in Lesson 18 he tells us, "Be calm when the unthinkable arrives." He returns to the story of the Reichstag fire as the ultimate example of what he calls terror management. A tyrant creates or exploits a single, shocking event to justify a permanent state of emergency. Vladimir Putin's rise to power in Russia after a series of mysterious apartment bombings in 1999 is a modern parallel. The sudden disaster that requires the end of checks and balances, the suspension of free speech, and the dissolution of opposition is the oldest trick in the authoritarian playbook. Don't fall for it. The lesson isn't to avoid feeling fear or grief in the face of tragedy. It's to recognize, from the very first moment, that authoritarians will use that fear and grief to consolidate power. Resisting that manipulation, right away, is one of the hardest and most important things a citizen can do. This advice is especially pointed in Lesson 7. Be reflective if you must be armed. This is a direct message to members of the police and military. The great evils of the past, he says, always involved policemen and soldiers finding themselves, one day, doing irregular things. They were asked to round up their neighbors, to enforce unjust laws, to stand by while paramilitaries committed atrocities. He reminds them that they must be ready to say no. So in the face of this dark and methodical process, the erosion of truth, the hollowing of institutions, the threat of violence, it can be easy to feel powerless. But Snyder's book isn't a counsel of despair. It's a call to action. The second half of his work is a powerful and practical playbook for how we, as individual citizens, can be the antidote. It starts with the smallest, most human acts. In Lesson 12, he says, "Make eye contact and small talk." This sounds almost trivial, but he explains that in times of fear and suspicion, these banal gestures take on profound significance. Memoirs from Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union during the Great Terror all share a single tender moment. People remember how their neighbors treated them. When friends and colleagues looked away or crossed the street to avoid them, fear grew. But a simple smile, a handshake, a word of greeting from a neighbor became a lifeline. A small act of defiance that affirmed their humanity. You might not know who feels threatened in your society today, he says. But if you affirm everyone, you can be sure that someone will feel better. This leads to a broader principle in Lesson 4. Take responsibility for the face of the world. Snyder introduces us to an idea from the great Czech dissident, Václav Havel. Havel told a parable about a greengrocer in communist Czechoslovakia. Every morning, the greengrocer puts a sign in his shop window that reads, "Workers of the world unite." He doesn't do it because he's a passionate communist. In fact, he couldn't care less about the slogan. He does it so the authorities will leave him alone. It's a small act of conformity. But, Havel asks, What happens when every shopkeeper, every office worker, every citizen follows the same logic? The entire public sphere becomes covered with signs of loyalty to the regime. The lie becomes the visible reality. And in that environment, resistance becomes unthinkable. Snyder's point is that the symbols of today enable the reality of tomorrow. When you see swastikas or other signs of hate, don't look away. Don't get used to them. Remove them yourself and set an example for others. When you're offered a chance to display a symbol of loyalty, make sure it's one that includes your fellow citizens rather than excludes them. From these small, personal acts, Snyder expands the circle of resistance outward. Lesson 13 is, practice corporeal politics. Power, he writes, wants your body softening in your chair and your emotions dissipating on the screen. Get outside. Put your body in unfamiliar places with unfamiliar people. Make new friends and march with them. The internet makes us feel like we're engaged, but true political change happens when people from different backgrounds meet in the real world. He gives the powerful example of the Solidarity movement in Poland in the 1980s. For years, the communist regime had kept workers and intellectuals divided and suspicious of each other. But, in 1980, when workers went on strike, intellectuals and professionals joined them. They were people from the right and the left, believers and atheists. They created trust where there had been none. That coalition of 10 million people eventually brought down the communist regime, not just in Poland but across Eastern Europe. But even as we act in public, we must protect our inner world. Lesson 14 is, establish a private life. Totalitarianism, Snyder reminds us, is the erasure of the difference between private and public life. Tyrants seek the hook on which to hang you. They want to know your secrets, your fears, your private conversations, so they can use them to control you. In our digital age, this is more relevant than ever. He warns us, scrub your computer of malware. Remember that email is skywriting. Consider using the internet less. Have personal exchanges in person. If we have no control over who sees our private lives and when, we have no real freedom. Resistance also means building and supporting the fabric of a healthy society. In Lesson 15, he urges us, contribute to good causes. The network of charities and non-governmental organizations is what we call civil society. It's the space between the individual and the government where we associate freely. Authoritarians of every stripe, fascist, communist, and modern, are hostile to these organizations because they create loyalties and connections the state can't control. And finally, he asks us to look beyond our own borders. Lesson 16 is, learn from peers in other countries. The challenges we face are part of a global trend, and no country will find a solution by itself. Keep up your friendships abroad. Make sure you and your family have passports. A passport, he says, isn't a sign of surrender. It's a tool of liberation. It allows us to see how other people, sometimes wiser than we are, have reacted to similar problems. Snyder concludes with two of his most profound lessons, which bring us back to the core of what it means to be a citizen. Lesson 19 is, be a patriot. Here, he draws a crucial distinction. A patriot isn't the same as a nationalist. A nationalist, he says, encourages us to be our worst, and then tells us we're the best. The nationalist's only truth is resentment. A patriot, by contrast, wants their nation to live up to its ideals. A patriot holds their country to universal standards of decency and justice, always wishing it well, and wishing that it would do better. A nationalist will tell you, it can't happen here. Snyder says that's the first step toward disaster. A patriot says, it could happen here, but we will stop it. And that leads to the final, sobering lesson. Lesson 20, be as courageous as you can. He ends the book with a stark truth. If none of us is prepared to die for freedom, then all of us will die under tyranny. This is the ultimate challenge. It's the summation of all the other lessons. The courage to stand out, to speak truth, to defend institutions, to resist in ways both small and large. History teaches us that freedom isn't the default state of human affairs. It's an achievement, and it's an achievement that must be defended by every generation. Walking through Timothy Snyder's 20 lessons feels like taking a masterclass in the fragility of freedom. The single most powerful idea that stays with me, and the one I hope stays with you, is that history isn't something that just happens to us. It's not some great, unstoppable wave we're powerless to resist. History is the sum total of millions of individual human choices. It's the choice to look away when a neighbor is being harassed, the choice to repeat a slogan without thinking, the choice to obey in advance. These small, seemingly insignificant acts of conformity are the soil in which tyranny grows. But just as powerfully, history is also made by the choice to stand out, the choice to defend an institution, the choice to speak the truth, even when your voice shakes, the choice to make eye contact with a stranger who's afraid. Snyder's work is a profound and deeply empowering reminder that we're not passive spectators in the story of our time. We are the authors. In a world of digital outrage, deep political polarization, and the constant, exhausting flood of disinformation, these lessons from the 20th century don't feel like history at all. They feel like a current events manual. The systematic attack on the very idea of truth, the erosion of trust in our institutions, the rise of us versus them rhetoric. These aren't things happening in some faraway land or distant time. They're part of the air we breathe right now. Snyder's message, however, isn't one of fear. It's one of empowerment. He shows us the darkest moments of the past, not to paralyze us, but to arm us. He's telling us we have an advantage that people in the 1930s and 40s didn't. We have their experience to learn from. As he writes, history does not repeat, but it does instruct. So how can we begin to apply these instructions in our own lives, starting today? Here are 3 simple, practical actions you can take. First, do a media audit. For just 1 week, make a conscious choice to read one long-form article from a well-researched, reputable source each day. Replace 30 minutes of scrolling through social media feeds with 30 minutes of deliberate, focused reading. This is a direct way to practice being kind to your language and to investigate for yourself. Second, practice corporeal politics locally. You don't have to organize a massive protest. Just get outside. Go to a local city council or school board meeting. Visit a farmer's market and talk to the person who grew your food. Join a local club, for hiking, for books, for whatever interests you. The point is to engage with your community in a physical space, not just a digital one, and to build connections with people who might be different from you. And third, choose one institution to support. Think of an institution you genuinely care about. It could be your local public library, a small independent newspaper, a human rights charity, or even a specific law that protects our rights. Find one small way to actively support it. It could be a $5 donation, an hour of volunteering, or simply speaking up and defending it when you hear it being unfairly criticized. It's a small way of making that institution yours. The great lesson of On Tyranny is that the future isn't yet written. We stand at a unique moment, with the lessons of the past laid bare before us. We can choose to be a historical generation, one that learns, that acts, and that defends the fragile miracle of a free society. The work belongs to us. We're the ones holding the pen. That was a look into Timothy Snyder's On Tyranny. We've walked through some of the most powerful lessons from the last century today. But I want to be clear. A summary is like looking at a map of a beautiful country. You can see the layout, you can understand the geography, but you can't feel the sun on your skin or hear the music in the streets. The real power of this book is in its quiet, personal impact. It's designed to be a small book you keep close, a guide you return to. If any of these stories or ideas have sparked something in you, I truly encourage you to get a copy. Reading it isn't just an intellectual exercise. It's an act of civic engagement, a way to arm yourself with the wisdom we desperately need right now. The link to the book is in the description. And if this journey into the past has given you value for the present, please consider hitting that subscribe button. We explore the world's most important books here, and I'd be honored to have you join our community of learners and leaders. Let's keep growing and keep defending what matters together.